Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Midsommar. This is written and directed by Ari Aster. This is Aster's second feature-length film after Hereditary, which came out about a year ago, came out last summer, and that film was beloved by audiences and it was also quite critically acclaimed. I think Hereditary is more of a psychological piece. It's more about the horror that comes from within your mind, whereas Midsommar is more kind of a study of socio-political norms, cultural norms, and behaviors, and it's all wrapped up in this metaphor for basically a breakup. This is a movie about a breakup. It's about coming to terms with all of that pain of change and the pain of jealousy, and then being reawakened by it and reborn. Aster apparently wrote this film in the middle of his own breakup, and I think you can really get that sense that he's living very vicariously through the main character, Danny. I'd say that Hereditary is a far more accessible film than this one for sure. But this film is intriguing a lot of people, and I've heard a lot of buzz about it. And you can see why, because just like Hereditary, it is very, very well directed. It is also very reminiscent of a lot of the films that we saw back in the 1970s and even the early 80s, films like The Exorcist and The Shining. And of course, I'd be crazy if I didn't mention probably its biggest influence, seemingly, which would be Wicker Man. And that's a film that is similar in the sense that it's also studying different cultures, culture shock, and pagan rituals, and those traditions as they relate to us. Just down to the smallest details, this film is so elaborate, so well thought out. That's its big strength, is its tone and its visual power. Just how intricate the murals and the paintings all over the walls are, and the symbols that are embroidered on the clothing, on the robes that the ladies wear and that the men wear throughout the film. It's just slowly revealing, almost like subliminally, how things are going to pan out, and it's just slowly revealing itself to be this very like horrific folkloric tale. And the most disturbing part, and I always said this about The Shining too, both those films I find so interesting because so little of it takes place in the dark, in the shadows. The majority of this film takes place during the day, and the violence and the horror is coming from people who are dressed in these white robes, and when the sun reflects off them, it's almost blinding, and they're wearing these flower crowns. And I love that. I love that the tension and the claustrophobia is building in such an ironic way. And again, there's irony because all these spaces are so open. You just see a bunch of fields and hills and mountains, and yet you just feel like the world is closing in on these characters and you're not sure why. And little by little, you realize that these characters may never leave this place. I do love that Ari Aster is very careful about how he employs close-ups. He's more of a long shot kind of guy, it seems, or he's not afraid to use a long shot. And I like that. I think that it creates a sort of a distance between the viewer and what's going on the screen, almost as if we're watching a play. The whole frame reveals itself and you kind of have to have your eye go to certain places rather than everything being handed to you on a silver platter telling you where to look all the time. And it's not that he doesn't use a close-up shot, because he does use quite a few close-ups as well, but I just mean that he's very careful about when he's utilizing that. I think he pays really close attention to the audience and wanting to always keep them at arm's length so that he can let the tension sort of build on its own and build more cerebrally. And that's something that, like David Fincher, that's kind of his philosophy, which I've always loved, just the idea of like, no, he very rarely used a close-up because he felt that that emotional intimacy, being invited to that closeness, should be earned more. This movie, both visually and tonally, really captures what a mushroom trip is so well. Just the essence of a bad trip that feels like it's never ending, because really this movie feels like one just really long bad trip. But I love how it's showing us how the ground heaves, and as though you can almost feel the spirits within the trees and within the blades of grass. Everybody around them has these very exaggerated features. It's that feeling of alienation and fear where we don't know or understand these people. And that's causing all these raging emotions and this claustrophobia to be magnified, the xenophobia perhaps to be magnified. Because there's a lot of primal energy in this film that is just wanting to wrestle its way to the surface. And like I said before, the detail in this film is really extraordinary. I'm sure that Aster and his production team, I'm sure that they did crazy amounts of research on, like, you know, as I said, like Scandinavian folklore and like Viking traditions. And that's very integral to the plot. It's important to move the story forward because you'll notice in a lot of the paintings that you see in the murals, the scenes on the wall, heavily foreshadow later events. And I love the murals. I like the idea of murals because they are like our modern day cave paintings, essentially, the result of human necessity to carry on tradition through ancestry and through just that social expectation. I was one of those people who thought that Hereditary was quite funny, and a lot of people didn't really understand where I was coming from, but I really do think that there is a lot of humor in his particular brand of horror film, and I think that there's even more humor here. It's funny, but in a different way, in a very eccentric sort of way. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of Jordan Peele's latest film, Us. He is really good at blurring the lines between that range on the emotional spectrum between humor and fear and how they're really not that different. And also both films, I think, in their own respective universes, of course, they are very different tonally, but they are speaking to, like I said, a lot of the social and political themes of our time. In terms of what the film means for me, that's something that I really needed to think about. I needed to sleep on this movie a little bit before I started to arrive at just what it made me feel. And I think that the key for me was just looking at how the outsiders both contrast the community that they are introduced to and how they are very similar as well. These are American tourists here that are in a place that they don't recognize, they don't understand, and naturally they are very uneasy by a lot of the traditions that they witness because they are very disturbing and very barbaric to them. And they may feel so different and so alienated from these people, but really they aren't that different. They are still primal beings, and the traditions are the key to life. I mean, for all of us, even if you're not necessarily a very traditional person. I don't consider myself very traditional, but yet I do follow traditions. We all follow them. We follow them whether they are rules or a routine, something that we know and that we are used to, but also out of social obligation or moral obligation. And we see that early on in the film. The film is set up, of course, to be about this relationship between Danny and her boyfriend, Christian. And Danny is a girl who is struggling with mental illness. You get that sense very early on. And she is worrying that her boyfriend doesn't love her anymore, that she's too much of a handful, and these emotions are weighing him down. And it turns out that she's right, because he is thinking about leaving her. He's been thinking about leaving her for a while, and I don't think that he really respects her, definitely doesn't really love her. But then, of course, this horrible family tragedy happens to her, and naturally he's not going to leave her during that difficult time. But it's more out of, not of want, but moral obligation and maybe perhaps social expectation. And also just, yeah, not to come off as like the biggest asshole of all time. And we do have our own sets of traditions that are adapted even for just the millennial generation, because this film is about people who seem to be in their early, mid-20s, even late 20s, we'll say. Some of them are very ambitious and competitive even, and there's this sort of masculine prowess that comes from it. And so a lot of their own expectations and what they know absolutely dominate their views. Wilhelm is the one who invites them all to his village, to his home, to this festival that he's grown up around. And he seems like the most compassionate one in the group. He's the one who seems to understand Danny, and he definitely really likes her. And he doesn't think that Christian is the right guy for her. And you start to think, what if all this pageantry, what if this is all some sort of elaborate ploy to bring her closer to him? It's never really explained. A lot of the events in this film aren't explained thoroughly, but you do kind of get that sense. For Danny to finally shine, to have her lowest moment and then be able to rise from it and become this May Queen that apparently she's meant to be to him. If that is the case, then all of these traditions are not what they seem to be. They come from malicious intent, from violent intent, from human weakness, jealousy. The whole film just reveals at its core, no matter who you are in the film, human frailty, the need to lash out and violence and all of that, but also the want to see somebody flourish as well. This is a very ambitious film. There are a lot of ideas going on in it, and it's a movie that you probably do want to see twice, I would think. And I would say in many ways it's more cohesive than a movie like Hereditary. I would say that more from a story standpoint, more from a structural standpoint. Things add up a little bit better towards the end, and there is more of a complete arc, whereas the ending of Hereditary, I remember it starting to sort of fall apart and became a little bit faulty as the film went on, mainly in the third act. And that's something that you start to realize as you think about it after the fact. This one just has maybe a little bit cleaner execution on paper. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that I did dislike about the film. I felt like it just didn't have the character motivations and that emotional center, an emotional thread throughout. Most of what we see here is preparation for this big emotional arc, for, of course, as I said, the breakup that is inevitably going to happen. But the emotional threads are just not fleshed out between those two main characters, which are integral. But instead we see it more handled thematically and just visually in the symbols and in the walls and all the stuff that you see around you, rather than dealing with the situations themselves more. And I think that that's part of why I thought it was handled better in Hereditary. You don't feel the emotional weight of it. And as the movie went on, as much as I was hypnotized and I couldn't stop, I couldn't take my eyes off the screen, at the same time there was something about it that left me a bit emotionally empty. And a lot of it is because Christian and Danny's emotional issues and their motivations for why they feel certain ways about each other just isn't delved into in a way that makes anything feel earned for me. We aren't really sure what is metaphysical and what isn't. What decisions are being made by the characters themselves, and when are they being controlled? I wanted these characters to be faced with more dilemmas on their own, where they're the ones in control, where they're facing the decisions. It could have explored more the mental illness. That's obviously something that they touch on earlier. And again, it's not really fleshed out in a way that feels meaty for me. There aren't those moral dilemmas that we start to see that are touched on at the beginning of the film carried throughout. And that kind of made me a little bit underwhelmed, just because I felt like they had a lot going for it. They have a premise where they could have really opened up these ideas in very unusual ways, but it fell short in those key areas. So for me, while I do find the film very intriguing, I also find it slightly overhyped. I know a lot of people are really interested in it, and this might be one of those movies that I do need to see multiple times, and maybe I might feel a little bit differently. Certainly open to that idea after seeing it, but I will say it is quite an experience, and I am absolutely going to recommend it. It's just very unsettling in such an off-kilter way, but also a very alluring way. The whole feeling while I was watching the movie, it made me feel like that feeling of when you think you might be sick, like, oh, I think I might have an upset stomach or something like that, but you're not sure if it's real or if it's in your mind, and you just hate that feeling that you're kind of hanging between, and that is how I felt. There's just this sort of queasy, subtle haze that is just lingering throughout. And I do find Ari Aster to be such a compelling figure in movies right now, and you know, he's good. This is a well-made movie and worth it, I think, for that. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All of my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you want to. Catch you next time.